providing a certain number of GPUs in a cluster, that there's certain configurations that the hyperscalers just wouldn't bother with, and that's partly the opportunity.
And they actually call it GPU as a service.
GPU as a service. It's quite a big thing, but I mean, lots of people talk about this now. Like HPE talks about it. Nvidia wants the telcos to buy GPUs.
Yeah.
You use them partly to run your radio access network and use the capacity that you're not using for the radio access network to sell as a sort of GPU as a service offering for companies that want to host AI-based applications kind of at the edge of the network, basically. So they do it inferencing at the edge, I think it would be then.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast, the penultimate one of the year. Just me and Ian this time. It feels like it's been a while since it's been just the two of us.
It does. Although it hasn't been that long.
No. But well, it's because like last week we did two on the bounce, didn't we? Both with guests.
Yeah.
At least now we don't feel compelled to drink fucking hard liquor from the off.
Oh yeah, where is it?
Well, we've still got the what's it called
Brimstone.
again? Brimstone. Yeah,
I don't think you can really drink that without ice, though.
No, we don't have ice. Neither. I normally bring, for people who know, we've got this Yeti that Danielle Royston bought us like 4 years ago. No, it must be 5+ years ago. It's pre-pandemic, wasn't it? And we still use that. Thank you, Danielle. But then I normally buy a bag of ice from Sainsbury's or Tesco's or whatever and just lob it in there. And I went to both on the way and neither of them had ice. I mean, what's going on?
There's no call for it in weather like this.
Well, you still want cold drinks. Wine. Yeah.
Or mulled cider, whatever that is.
Yeah, why when it gets cold you suddenly got to mull everything?
Right, you don't have mulled beer, do you?
Over my dead body. So yeah, that's that. But yeah, so we don't have ice, so we're going to have slightly less cold beers. But I back us to soldier through it.
Yeah.
What have we been up to? Actually, before I get into what we've been up to, for me, since the last pod, I had a mad one. Last Sunday morning, I was up and I was quite mercifully clear-headed because I quite often just take Saturday off because I'll have had a large one on Friday.
I had Saturday and Sunday off.
Yeah. So I took Saturday off, went to bed early. You know, I was waking up feeling fine. I was just on my computer, which is at one end of my house. And at about 9 a.m, there was a sudden crash, a really catastrophic crash. I fucking jumped out of my skin. And then after the crash, there was a sort of scraping, and then I just saw, and then my window's to my left, and it's quite a small little sort of cubbyhole, my office, and I just saw loads of cedar tree cascading down by the side of my window. And basically, we had a storm in the UK last weekend.
Storm Dara.
And my neighbour's cedar tree just fell over onto my house.
Oh my God.
I know, and hit the bit of the house I was sitting in. So you sort of think, you know, and
any damage?
Yeah, damage to the roof, and you know what with excesses and things that aren't covered by the insurance, I'm going to be about $1,000 down on it, which I could do without. But then again, at least I did have some insurance, so they're still going to hopefully get about another $2,000 or so that it's going to cost to repair the roof.
Yeah,
and then we spent all of that day just trying to put like buckets and stuff under the holes in the roof because it was pissing it down all day. But anyway, that was very dramatic. And you know, if the tree had fallen more cleanly on that side of the house, I might not be here today. So that's a bit of a brush with death.
This is how people end up in a bad way in these storms.
Well, indeed. And I was so complacent about it. They've had that tall tree there as long as we've been there, and I didn't think twice about it. According to the tree people who came and cleaned up the debris, it wasn't even diseased or anything.
Right.
It just, yeah.
Do the neighbours feel bad about it?
Yeah. They're elderly and they're all apologetic. I was like, you know, shit happens.
Yeah.
But yes, and hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? But yeah, so that was my little bit of drama. But then back to like normal, more regular opening bollocks. What have we been up to? I'm going to do. So, what did we do? We went out after the pod, and we had a couple with Jim, and he's a cool guy.
Yeah.
I won't say specifically what we discussed because it's all just, you know, social. It's not on the record. But we had a little bit of a chat about like the US and politics and that sort of thing, and it's really interesting. You know, I'm the recipient of so much incoming stuff from the podcasts I listen to, like Rogan and so on. Really interesting just to talk to a regular American.
Hunter.
Well, he's not regular; he's a CEO, but you know what I mean. Yeah. A real live American about this stuff and get some different perspectives. So thanks, Jim, and it's great chatting to you, mate. And thanks for the brimstone. sort of thanks. My liver's not thanking you. And then, so that was that. And then we haven't been up to much except for Tuesday. You didn't come in, but there was a bit of a get-together. It's worth acknowledging it. So our bit of Informa, which is called Informa Tech, which is about a fifth of the company, roughly by revenue, I think, has merged with another company called Tech Target, which is a sort of a big publisher, a big sort of B2B publisher. I think their banner title is Computer Weekly.
Yeah.
And they've sort of merged, and it's still majority owned by Informa, but it's sort of a separate listed company as well. And anyway, so we're now part of a new company called Informa Tech Target. And we all had to get together in this building on Tuesday, and I got to chat. A shout out to Brian Glick and Joe Halloran from Computer Weekly, both of whom we bumped into before. They're both good lads, and they're now colleagues. And yeah, it was just good to chat to various people. So that's what I did on Tuesday.
We might have to get one of them on the pod at some point. Who knows?
I think so. Well, I keep threatening to get Joe on.
Yeah,
I think it'd be good fun.
Mm-hmm.
The only slightly ominous thing about Joe is he actually knows a hell of a lot about the technical stuff.
Yeah.
So I might feel a bit inadequate. I'll get him to dumb it down for me. And then yesterday, I mean, I've banged on for a bit. Why don't you say what we were up to yesterday?
Yesterday
Ian?
we went for lunch with Nokia and Nscale, which I think we're going to talk about in a bit more detail later. But they had an announcement about a deal they've done, and then they treated us to a sort of deep dive on the ins and outs.
Just at the chat with a lot of their senior team.
Their senior team. So it was Paul Alexander from Nokia.
So he's the new.
He's basically CEO of the UK, but he's particularly involved on the sort of network infrastructure. And he's
a new guy.
I've
forgotten where I'm so bad at remembering names. Who was the guy we had on the pod who was the head of the UK?
Phil Civitar.
Oh yeah, he's the new Phil Civitar.
He's the new Phil Civitar. So Phil Civitar's gone, and on the Nscale side, they had a guy called David Power. He was probably the most senior executive. He's CTO.
He's CTO.
And they had that guy called Sam Sturges, who's head of investor relations, and there are a couple of other executives there as well, but they were more sort of on the fringes of the conversation, I think. Really.
Right. Is that Sam's main bit? Is investor relations?
Yeah.
I mean, I know he sounded very grown up when he said, because it was a really nice long lunch.
Yeah.
And then we're like 2 or 3 hours in, and he was like, I've lost track of time. I've got to go and do some investor calls.
Yeah, he's head of investor relations, I think.
I see.
Yeah.
But he's also like an engineer and really knows all the techie stuff as well.
Yes. I mean, I looked at his LinkedIn profile, and he's got quite an impressive academic background.
Yeah.
Like including sort of masters in electrical,
and he looks about
the double
20 years old as well.
Yeah,
which just adds to the humiliation of what an accomplished person he is.
Yeah.
And sorry, Sam, if I insulted you when I said you look too young to be VP of Investor Relations. I only meant it as an affectionate joke.
Yeah, he's been. I don't know if he's as young as he has got a youngish looking face, but he was at
some people do have those.
I think he was at Cambridge Consultants for a while, which is Cap Gemini or Cap Gemini.
He probably just looks about 10 years younger than he is.
Yeah, and so
which is fine. There's worse things. I sometimes get that compliment.
Yeah.
So that was really good fun, and the lunch was fun. It was at a place. What was the name? Can you remember the name of the venue?
It was called the Zeta, I think.
Yeah,
Zeta Inn or something.
I can find it on my calendar here.
It was in Clerkenwell.
Yeah,
which is this strange little place that's apparently in London, but you would never think so if you're travelling there.
It's apparently in
the
London.
Southwest.
Yes, Clerkenwell is in London. I can confirm that.
And,
the Zeta. You're right. It's Zetter.
It's quite an old bit of London. It's got a sort of Samuel Pepys feel about it.
Yeah, Clerkenwell. I mean, you weren't that familiar with it, but it is well known and has been well known for a long time. Decades, possibly centuries, as a cool little enclave in London. It was cool back before things like Hoxton and that sort of thing were cool.
Yeah.
But yeah,
that's really far out, isn't it? That's almost in Essex.
No, it's not.
Is it not?
No, Hoxton's like Old Street.
Well, exactly, almost in Essex.
But yes, I thought Zeta was cool. It felt like a private members club because you just went in. It obviously was once just a residential place, and the front door still looks like you're just going into someone's house.
Well, I couldn't find it at first. I was wandering around in circles, and then ran into Elena from Liberty.
So special shout out to Elena, who we're going to spend a lot more time in a week's time when she does our Christmas quiz with us. Yeah. But yeah, she found it and arranged it. Nice one, Elena. I thought it was a really cool venue.
It was brilliant. Yeah.
And inside it's very homely and cozy. It looks like a sort of. It almost feels like you're in a time warp, doesn't it? You can imagine being there like 100, 200 years ago.
It had a very strange ceiling full of stags' heads.
Yeah, that's right.
And antlers.
Little
It
antlers.
looked like you could sort of swing across it if you were a 5-year-old. And I was sort of hoping you were going to do that when you'd had a few drinks, but you decided not to.
I'm neither a 5-year-old nor into swinging on things, nor could it possibly have supported my weight.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I thought the meal was cool, but it was quite quirky.
Yeah.
Like
the quirkiest thing was the size of the plates for the main course.
Yeah. Well, then there were bowls.
They were bowls, and I was struggling to cut the meat without tilting the bowl all the time. And I noticed
it was baffling.
Paul from Nokia had the same problem. We were like sort of tipping the bowls every time we tried to sort of slice this bit of turkey.
And they
it's just a weird thing to
So they basically did us like turkey breast with all the trimmings,
which is really nice quality. By
yeah,
the way.
and but the way they served the food, I thought was quite interesting. They came round and it was like this growing tapestry of like trimmings. So they'd come round with some parsnips and everyone get a parsnip, and then they come round with some Brussels sprouts and so on, and some potatoes, and even like the cranberry sauce was a separate little journey where everyone got a little splat of cranberry sauce, and it just built up in these quite small bowls.
Yeah.
And then finally the turkey breast and stuff came round, and it was nice food, but it was an unorthodox way of doing it.
Yeah, the food was delicious. I just thought the serving was a bit odd, and I thought they needed bigger plates.
Well,
that would be my recommendation.
The other thing that was funny about the serving is when they brought the main course.
Lovely staff though. Yeah,
no, they were all cool. But when they brought the main course, they came round to everyone, but they kind of missed a couple of people.
They did, yeah.
And it's almost like they came round and like they got sick of it, and then like they served like 3/4 of it, and then just lobbed it in the middle and went, "Oh fuck it, do it yourself."
Well, I think David Power from Nscale was sitting next to me, and I don't think he'd had turkey until like sort of 15 minutes into when everybody else had started eating.
So it was, like I said, it was quirky. I think Elena kept them on their toes. We never get to see serious CEO Elena.
No.
We just know smiley, fun, chilled Elena.
Yeah.
But you know she can assert herself when she wants to. Yeah. I think she kept them on her toes. So good for you, Elena. But on the whole, I thought it was brilliant. It was a great choice of venue, and the odd little idiosyncrasy to the serving in no way diminishes it. It was cool, and they gave us loads of their time. We hung around for a while. The wine was really nice. We had a bit of bubbly to start. We had 3 courses. Yeah, can't complain, man.
It was excellent.
The only thing I said is, why aren't we getting more of this? I mean, I know Paul Adams, who's from Nokia, who's sat in this room when we've recorded a pod before. I know he agrees.
Yeah.
That, and I'm pretty sure Elena agrees as well, that a bit more old school PR wouldn't go amiss.
Yeah, for sure.
So here's me lobbying for it again.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I really appreciated it, and it was good to get a sort of deep dive into Nscale. To me, sounds like a really interesting company as well. I mean, I think we're going to talk about it later on. But
go for it now. Oops, I haven't muted my phone.
We're going to do that as the first session, are we? Might go into it. So they're I didn't know much about them, and apparently they're only founded, I think, at the start of this year. So they're really new.
Yeah, they came out of stealth. May, I think.
Mode. Yeah. They've got
so they might have been around a little bit longer than that, but not that long.
Yeah, they've got quite a bit of funding behind them. Like they raised about 125 million in a Series A round, which is very high. I think it's like one of the highest Series A rounds outside the sort of US this year.
For people who don't know how that works, they tend to do it by letters in that how many rounds of funding you get. And so it's A is one of the first rounds of funding, bar whatever seed funding.
The seed funding got before that, I think. And they have this kind of quite impressive lineup of young, talented, very smart people, some of whom were obviously at the lunch yesterday. And they're kind of they're interesting, partly because they're a UK company, so it's always nice to see UK businesses, in the tech sector trying to do something there. And they're also trying to get into the data center area, but very much a sort of AI positioned data center to do what's become called in the world where everything gets called as a service. It's GPU as a service, I think, is the model where they invest in the infrastructure, and they have this data center they're building. I think it's near, how do you pronounce is it Stavanger in Norway?
Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah. So I think it's near there. So
which I think it's quite a well-known sort of port or naval base or something like that. Rings a bell from like reading about World War II and that sort
I think those bits of northern, like the Nordic countries further up north are sort of regarded as being very good locations for data centres because for a start you've got a lot of open space. you've got quite a cool environment, which I think helps. You don't want it somewhere in the...
No, I think that's a big part of it. And it
Sahara.
makes sense given that a hell of a lot of the expense of data centers is cooling.
Cooling, yeah.
So why not stick one in the North Pole?
Yeah, and David, who I was sitting next to, was talking about the need for kind of these new liquid cooling solutions because they're running these GPU clusters that are very kind of, that can be very energy hungry. You need sort of new, more innovative cooling technologies being introduced into the data center environment these days. And access to power is like a really big deal. I think when we had Jim on last week, he was talking about this, wasn't he? This sort of,
it was quite a fortuitous bit of overlap.
It was a good overlap, but he was very much talking about this issue of where do you get the power from with these with the need for the sort of processing that's going on at the GPU level now and running these large language models. It's driven up the kind of energy consumption by the hyperscalers massively if you look at what they're getting through each year.
And one of the real...
it's not an obviously green story, is it?
No, far from it. And I quite enjoy reminding people of that because everyone gets a bit twitchy.
Yeah. So they're sort of plugging into nuclear power plants, I think, in America.
Well, that's kind of one of the points I think I made over lunch is like, we all talk green until there's a sudden imperative to just blow loads of energy because we might make some money out of it. I mean, you know me, I'm always very sceptical about green rhetoric.
Do you know what, though? This could actually be a green thing.
Right, why?
Because what could happen is Amazon and, I mean, this is getting slightly off the Nscale topic, but it's related. But Amazon and Microsoft and Google are chucking loads of money at these GPUs and they're getting through all this energy each year. Now, okay, nuclear is one option for them to do it, but they basically need to find alternative sources of energy to run this.
And their
stuff.
one's hydroelectric, isn't it?
So they're using hydroelectric,
the Norwegian
Nscale,
one.
Yeah. But you don't want to be using fossil fuels because they're trying to. Partly it's obviously to show that they're kind of committed to the green rhetoric they come out with.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably they're just looking for, in a world where energy supplies are hard to get hold of these days and you've got sort of power constraints, there's definitely an interest for them in finding something, if they can make it economical and it is renewable. There's an argument that the amount of money that those companies can throw at this might be the breakthrough that we need. That you get something coming out of that. Where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, renewables have always been perceived to be, it doesn't really add up. Yeah, the model just doesn't really add up when you compare it to...
And you look at bad strategic decisions like Germany decommissioning all its nuclear power stations, and then suddenly Russia goes to war with Ukraine and their whole strategy's fucked up.
Yeah, and this is the thing, though. It's like, where do we get our energy supplies from in future? And if we need this much energy, then there's a good reason to try and invest in renewables, but it probably hasn't had the oomph, arguably, that it needs. And it might be something that a company like Amazon, with its massive R&D budget, or Google or Microsoft, might have some breakthrough where they go, we've managed to do this with solar or whatever it is.
One of the big ones, and this is directly relevant to telecoms and was a central theme of what Jim spoke about on the previous pod, is you used to, back in the day, for a variety of reasons, you would try and build your data centers as close to where the majority of the consumption is going to be, on the outskirts of cities or whatever.
Yeah.
And now, because the power needs supersede everything else, and also because the networking technology permits it, you can have a data center in the middle of nowhere or up in the fucking North Pole where you hardly have to pay.
So the reason Nscale's done it there clearly is like access to space. A cool environment anyway, because it's like Arctic Circle, and access to power. They've got this hydroelectric they can plug into,
so it's all good,
and it's all good. So it's a UK company with this. I did ask them, and it was all on the record, so I think we can say this. But are you doing something in the UK? And apparently they're in conversations at the moment about potential data center investments that they can make.
Well, and that's one of the ways in which they're really exciting. I'd never heard of Nscale before, but I felt better about it knowing they only came out of stealth 6 months ago.
Yeah.
Paul sort of sarkily went, did you do any research on them before you came over? And I went, no, I don't know dick about them. Let's take it from the top.
But there's not a lot you can research on them anyway. I mean, they're so young.
So there you go, Paul. How dare you?
There's only a limited amount. I mean, I think this is I haven't written anything on this yet, but I do intend to tomorrow. So by the time this goes out, maybe my piece will be up as well. But the interesting thing about us being able to go to that lunch is because they're such a young company, and I think it's quite a hard thing to get your head around some of this GPU as a service stuff.
And we'll get into that specifics.
Yeah, from a sort of mainstream news perspective, it maybe is a bit more in the weeds than they'd initially write about until they've been around a little bit longer.
Which is where it helps to actually have a long chat and learn about it.
And so they're a really interesting company. I mean, the reason Nokia are there is they've done this deal with them to provide sort of.
And we wrote that up yesterday.
Yeah,
ended up inadvertently crashing their embargo. There was a confusion.
Well, I think we did as well. We put it in Eurobytes, in our Eurobytes.
Yeah, well, there was just some confusion over, but they didn't seem to mind. Because I remember I turned up and they said, we got this embargoed press release. And I went, but the embargo's lifted now, yeah? And they went, no. And I went, oh, shit, we've already published it.
Yeah. No,
but it didn't seem to, no one seemed to panic, so obviously it wasn't that big a deal.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, in case people are wondering, it's written by one of our writers, Nick Wood, and our headline says, Nokia bags data center networking deal with AI cloud specialist Nscale.
Yeah.
And Nokia is sort of, it's all its fixed side.
Yeah.
And it provides comms within the data center and without.
I think it's mainly in, though, isn't
it?
This is
so without, it will be via people like, what are they called? Week?
What? Oh, I see what you mean. You're talking about a dark fiber arrangement for to connect up data centers. Yeah, it could. Although there are data centers, I think, that build their own infrastructure to link the other data centers up, aren't there? So,
but they do a lot of stuff within the data center.
Yeah, I mean,
there was lots of talks of clusters and
so I think the EXA thing's interesting because where he would I think we talked about Nokia a bit with Jim, and he was saying that this deal where Nokia's taking over Infinera. Or trying to. I don't know what that hasn't gone through yet, actually. I wouldn't have thought it would need as much regulatory review as it seems to be having.
See what the internet has to say about that.
But that's an optical deal where you would run optical transport between data centres and use Nokia's technology to sort of link them up. I think what's happening in this case is it's more about like connectivity within the actual data centre environment, and they're using these Ethernet-based routers that Nokia sells. It's like a big part of its network infrastructure unit, which includes IPs one strand, opticals another, and sort of fixed access.
That's right. I've always found the distinction between those a little bit confusing, but there we are. Yeah. We don't need to get into it now.
It's like routers and switches and this sort of thing. It's
as opposed
like these
to
boxes
like
and
fiber and PON and all that.
Yeah, as opposed to sort of ONTs and OLTs and all that stuff. And but they're the alternatives for them. I mean, there's obviously other companies doing sort of Ethernet-based equipment, like, they're saying that Huawei's not one of the companies they're seeing as a competitor at the moment, which I suspect is partly to do with geopolitics. But it will be people like Cisco, perhaps, that they're seeing some competition from, and Arista, is it? I think does
you're talking about competing with Nokia in this
particular market. And then the other obvious solution to use, and the one that I think has probably, when you're talking about GPUs and NVIDIA's GPUs, has probably almost been a sort of default, is this technology called InfiniBand, which is like a rival to Ethernet. The trouble, and I asked David about this, and he said, well, the trouble with InfiniBand is that it's basically proprietary. It's only NVIDIA that does it. They bought this company called Mellanox, if you remember, a few years ago, and Mellanox was the InfiniBand company, and InfiniBand was set up to be an open standard. It was meant to have support from other parts of the industry, but it's not ended up working out that way. It's ended up just becoming a Mellanox and now an NVIDIA thing that NVIDIA is basically using to link up GPU clusters within data centers. And I think the bad news for InfiniBand is that people don't really want that today, do they? They want optionality, and they want. People are worried enough about using.
There was a conversation about Ethernet, and I just thought, God, Ethernet's been around for ages, and yet it's still. I mean, presumably it gets refined or improved or something.
Yeah. But that's a standard that has support from the industry, and I remember seeing some data from an analyst company. Probably one of the equity analysts, actually, a couple of years ago, about projected growth for InfiniBand and Ethernet, and their expectation was that Ethernet would start to take market share from InfiniBand simply because people want the competition.
And as you say, the vendor plurality thing is
vendor plurality. Exactly.
I mean, it came up, and I'm not saying, obviously, given that everything was on the record, all the Nscale people were careful to sort of hedge their position.
Yeah.
But this is my own interpretation and conjecture. But NVIDIA's fucking dominant right now.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think they did talk up AMD on the GPU.
Well, they
side.
did talk up AMD, and then obviously you don't want to have an InfiniBand. I don't know how
exactly.
InfiniBand.
So you
would
don't
work
want to
if
be
you tried
reliant on
use it with-
Nvidia for everything. Do
Yeah,
you?
exactly. Yeah.
So I would think that's another reason, because I mean, CUDA, their platform is very much the default in that space.
Yeah.
And so people aren't just buying these GPUs off them; they're buying a whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
And if you're also buying a lot of their networking tech, then that's going to become an issue, isn't it?
Exactly.
Especially as they're supply constrained. I'm not suggesting that Nvidia behaves in bad faith at all. It's just normal market dynamics. You don't. I mean, they can't make enough GPUs right now, can they?
Yeah, exactly.
So they're having to turn people away, and obviously that gives them the option to. I think I made a joke to do that dynamic pricing, like buying Oasis tickets.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought all that was interesting, and I thought the market segment that Nscale resides in was interesting. I was on a.
Well, that's probably the most interesting bit, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I think for Nokia, just before we move on to that,
go ahead.
for
Sorry.
Nokia, this is quite a good story, really, because the mobile market, which we talk about mainly on this pod, and I think we both know that better than this. I'm a bit less comfortable talking about some
No,
of
I
this
get a bit
stuff, I have to be
scared
honest.
with some of the fixed stuff.
But that's the growth opportunity really at the moment, I think, for Nokia is mobile network infrastructure, that part of the business. And it's not maybe the fixed access stuff. I think if you remember 2 or 3 years ago or during the pandemic was a real driver. When fibre was being built out a lot in the UK and there was like a surge of interest by altnets and deals being done, and BT was obviously off on its mission to kind of take fibre everywhere, and that's starting, I think, not to slow down, but it's certainly past the halfway point now. So there's a limited amount for that to go. I think a lot of other European markets are pretty developed on that front. So is Asia. Maybe the US provides some kind of pickup. But you look at this data center world with what's going on with AI and the kind of explosion in traffic that you're getting in that, between data centers themselves and within data centers between these GPU clusters. There's clearly a need to have connectivity solutions provided in that environment. And Ericsson doesn't do that. Huawei's not very popular these days in Europe, so
Indeed.
you're not going to be using that as an option. So Nokia's almost, I'm going to say it's a default, because obviously when it comes to things like IP routers, they're saying that they're seeing competition from the likes of, Cisco and Arista, but they've got a really big opportunity there. I mean, you could see that being that could be the real driver of growth, I think, for them in 2025. If they can seal this deal with Infinera, which they're saying they're doing partly to the other big player in that space, obviously Ciena in the optical space. And if they can get this deal through with Infinera, it puts them in a much better position, I think, to be competitive against Ciena there. And then you've got this IP routing stuff that they're doing with people like Nscale. Nscale's not a one-off. I think Sam was saying there's like 50 of these, what did he call it, Neo AI data centers.
But all he meant by Neo was new.
New, yeah.
It's
just
not a
fancy
technical
word.
term.
No.
Yeah.
So there's kind of other things happening. But yeah, you were going to talk about the market.
Yeah. Well,
segment
so what do they do? I mean, it was good actually. I had to do a lot of learning quite quickly, and the sitting around the table format is great because you just constantly got dialogue bouncing around, and you got a lot of information flying around, and you and I throwing questions all over the place. And they were, fair play to them, any question you threw at them, they gave a pretty good answer pretty quickly, didn't they?
Yeah.
So here's yet another lobby in favour of that sort of format, because I think it works. Obviously the spokespeople have got to be up to the job, and they were, but then it works really well. It's actually a really efficient way of introducing journalists into a sort of deep dive of what you're doing, much better than a conference call or a white paper or something like that, which I'd certainly probably be too lazy to read.
Yeah.
And so basically what you've got, my understanding, and I'm going to say this, I'm going to say it first for you to correct me or refine it if you perceived it differently. And we've got data center capacity, and then suddenly with the boom of with the Gen AI boom we're in now, there's a ton more data center capacity, which is why everyone in NVIDIA is driving around in Lambos. And if we've got someone, we should get someone from NVIDIA on the pod and see if they turn up, just screech to a halt in a Lambo, like a Miami Vice outside the building. Because most of it so far has been about training these large language models. And in my very layman, ignorant perspective on it, a large language model is basically stuffing tons and tons and tons of information into a model, into what seems to me like just a very big and sophisticated and dynamic database, which can then, as a result of this training, then when that model is queried, can then dip into this enormous sort of lake of information that it's got to hand.
They call it inference, don't they?
Well, so that's the bit I was leading up to. So you've got the training bit, which seems to be especially GPU intensive, and so it turned out, much to NVIDIA's joy, that to do all this stuff, you need the kind of processing that graphics processing units do rather than CPU, central processing units, which is like parallel processing rather than serial processing. You need to be able to process tons of shit at once.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're doing so well. And then you've got these hyperscalers like Amazon and Meta and Google that have got all these data centers, and they've got all their public cloud stuff. But they seem to be optimized for a sort of certain level of service delivery.
Yeah.
And then you've got. I
think that was their big pitch, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Really.
And then you've got like bespoke service delivery, which is one thing they spoke about. Someone could say, I need this specific thing, and they can gear up. I don't know if they make a whole new data center, but maybe they can just allocate a bit of their existing data centers, just do that, and put in specialist hardware if needed. But then there's also like the surge capacity.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a whole niche which they seem to reside in, which is like, what if you need more than one of the hyperscalers can provide right now?
Yeah.
Then you've got a more specialist operator like them, where you just dip into them and they say, yeah, we can meet your capacity, and that's part of their niche. Was that?
Yeah, totally. I think that there's like the assumption maybe by people like me before yesterday is to think that where's the role really for anybody else, because the hyperscalers have got it all wrapped up, haven't they? They're the guys who are investing in the GPUs, and if you want,
I think I asked, why do we need you?
Yeah, and if you want something that's based on what GPUs can do, then you just go to the hyperscalers. But it's much more complicated than that. It sounds like there are these gaps that there are these areas where that they're not filling, basically, as you say, more dynamic sort of services and providing a certain number of GPUs in a cluster. That there's certain configurations that the hyperscalers just wouldn't bother with, and that's partly the opportunity.
And they actually call it GPU as a service.
GPU as a service. It's quite a big thing, but I mean, lots of people talk about this now. Like HPE talks about it. NVIDIA wants the telcos to buy GPUs.
Yeah.
You use them partly to run your radio access network, and use the capacity that you're not using for the radio access network to sell as a sort of GPU as a service offering for companies that want to host AI-based applications kind of at the edge of the network, basically. So do inferencing at the edge, I think it would be then.
Yeah, so we've still got to get back to the difference between training and inference, which I think is interesting. I'm very much sort of learning on the job about how AI really works. But I think the precedent set for what you were just describing, from my understanding, goes all the way back to AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, which is actually where Amazon gets most of its profit from, not the actual, buying tat off the internet. And basically they had to build a shitload of data center infrastructure in order to service their e-tail stuff. And then it turned out that someone clever, I presume Jeff Bezos was part of it because he's a very clever guy, just went, hold on a sec, we're not using this resource half the time, or whatever they thought. How can we monetize it? And then that's how AWS was created. I'm sure people from AWS listening to this are cringing at me butchering their story.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they and fair play to them, they scaled up this whole new operation of just offering these web services. And this seems like it's in that direction in terms of concept, yeah?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And so we'll have to see how it plays out, I suppose, for them, because it's early days. It's like the investment stage, isn't it? Raising funds and putting in the connectivity.
So we just said that, didn't they? Got about 150 mil.
They got, I think it's something like 125 to 150. I can't remember exactly what Sam said. I have to go back and check it. But those press releases are all in the public domain now about that funding round. Anyway, I think that's most. Well,
they were since we crashed their embargo.
Yeah, well, did that mention the funding, the embargo?
No, that's true. Actually, I don't think it
deal?
did.
But,
no, fair
enough. But they've done this deal with Nokia. They're putting in place the connectivity within the data center that they need. They're at the kind of ramp up stage, aren't they? And then I think, David Power did mention like there's sectors they're dealing with include things like healthcare, and they've obviously got some. I think an important thing he was saying is that they get anchor tenants in. They don't just build.
Yeah.
They actually have people who
That's
are
true.
committed
No, that
to,
was a big part of their
they've
commercial
got people who are
go-to-market.
committed to buy services, which is great for them because, I mean, further out in time, if some of this stuff doesn't work out the way that the kind of AI cheerleaders are hoping, there might be some kind of backlash potentially. If you're trying to be negative about it, you could see a deterioration in demand for this sort of thing. But the fact that they've got these companies who are willing to sort of sign on the dotted line and will make a commitment to buy GPU as a service from you over a certain amount of time and on this level, I think is really good, because you don't want to go and make all this investment and then there's nobody build it and they will come, and then it turns out they don't come. That's a bit of a disaster. So
no, I think
it's a good model.
Sam was very keen to stress that they in many ways, I think he used the word, in many ways they're quite cautious.
Yeah,
i.e. they're building according to at least partially, if not entirely, proven demand, rather than just speculatively.
Yeah, totally. And then,
which is sensible. I mean, that's how most people would like to do it. But sometimes you just go, fuck it, the demand will come, and you're a bit more speculative. For whatever reason, they're a little bit more cautious.
Well, I think it's probably an easier thing to do on a B2B basis, isn't it? You can't, if you set up a mobile phone network, you can't go around the country saying, if we build this 5G network and spend 11 billion on it, as Three and
that would be a stupid thing to do, wouldn't
it? Will you get a phone contract with us? Will you sign here and guarantee that you're gonna? I mean, it doesn't quite happen the same way, does it, in the kind of consumer facing world? But it's a good approach. I mean, they're all pretty impressive people. Yeah. And the model sounds good. And then I think the other thing they were saying about the opportunity is this, which touches on something I think that Jim was talking about last week as well, this concern within the EU and Europe and the UK as well, actually, for sort of data sovereignty. It's not really an EU thing. I think it's just a country thing that people want a certain degree of.
Oh, but there's regulatory.
There's a regulatory side to it, but it's probably there around the world. That people want data to be stored closer to home, or they want an alternative.
Sovereign cloud, they call it.
Sovereign cloud's the fancy word for it. Yeah, and. The hyperscalers have tried to move into that business area a little bit, I think, by opening data centers on, French soil, say, or in Germany. But clearly, if there's a UK domiciled company that's doing a similar thing, then that'll look very attractive, I think, to some organisations.
Yeah, and I liked, and I definitely said this in conversation yesterday. As a UK technology journalist, I am a bit biased in favour of wanting to cover UK success stories, partly because, we just cover American tech companies so much of the time, or I suppose quite often Swedish and Finnish as well, or East Asian or whatever, but not often UK. But we've got a world-class university system. We've got by global standards, a fairly well-educated workforce, and we've got all these things going for us, and we've got these hubs like Silicon Fen around Cambridge and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that we're notorious for is we're good at starting stuff up. Like we'll spin something out of a university project or something, but then the Yanks grab it and scale it and monetize it and actually make a big business out of it. We're not very good at that scaling up bit. I think there are other reasons. I've spoken to other people in the past anecdotally that our VC scene is a bit
it's not
stodgy.
Yeah, I think that you're competing against something like Silicon Valley, which is very developed, and you've got an amazing university in close proximity to well-established VCs, and you've got the tech community there as well, and it all kind of comes together in this kind of bubbling cauldron that's just perfect. Yeah. Whereas trying to set anything up as a rival to that these days would be very, very hard. It's like trying to build a TSMC from scratch or something.
Indeed,
and it's
indeed. Although I think Silicon Valley might be past its peak. I think there are a few reasons why it's not quite.
Well, it's still
what
where
it
all
was.
The big money
still
is,
where a lot
but
of it
is. I think that the startup scene itself is a bit awkward these days because people just the investment activity just seems to be driven now by the hyperscalers, doesn't it? And
the
opportunity for disruption doesn't seem to be there at the moment in the way that it perhaps used to be. We saw Google come along in the late 90s, was it? Early 2000s, and all of a sudden it's a few years later it's one of the biggest companies in the world.
Meta and
it's very hard to
AWS.
see that sort of thing happening these days. I mean, OpenAI maybe is a good example of of someone coming along with a startup.
Yeah, but that's
model.
basically owned by Microsoft.
Well, this is what I mean, though.
Yeah,
they get snapped up very quickly by the hyperscalers, and then they're just an example of hyperscaler.
No, I mean, it's a tangent, but
dominance.
it's a relevant tangent. There's just enormous gravitational field of these, what was the acronym? We used to call them something. But yeah, Google, Amazon, Meta.
FANG was one of them.
FANG, there we are. Yeah. That's right. FANG, yeah, and I used to joke that you had to put
There's
Netflix.
GAFA was one.
You had
as
to put
well.
Netflix in there, or it would be a word that you get cancelled for.
Yeah.
At least in America, it means cigarette in England. But
we're slightly out of date now, anyway. Now that Facebook's no longer called Facebook.
No, so it's Meta. Now we got Mangs or Mags. Yeah. Mags is all right. We won't get in trouble for that.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And actually, Google's Alphabet, so it's all over the
fucking
fucking place. But we all know who they are, and then a few other people get thrown in, like Apple, but they do slightly different thing. Most of their revenue is more from devices and consumer services than it is from hyperscaler type of stuff. And Netflix, I don't think really counts because they've got a very specific business model.
Yeah.
But anyway, we all know who these American tech giants are. And I use the word gravitational pull because, as you were just describing it, it's almost impossible for startups and smaller organizations not to just get sucked into the area. Like Google and Meta have got so much control over internet advertising, for example.
Yeah.
Like one tangent we were chatting about yesterday was media business models, and it's very hard to sustain the traditional media business model of just monetizing audience in a very flat, commoditized way, because nearly all of that ad money now goes to Google or Facebook or Meta.
Yeah.
And maybe one or two others. We're slightly insulated because I suppose you could say we do more bespoke media services like webinars and white papers and surveys and videos at my World Congress and that sort of thing. But if all you're doing is trying to monetize raw traffic, hardly anyone's making money out of that except Google and Meta, I think, right now.
Yeah, totally. It's hard to envisage a startup coming along and 20 years from now being one of the world's biggest companies, as happened at the kind of turn of the millennium. That those days at the moment just seem to be over, and maybe it'll change. Who knows?
Well, there's increasing regulatory pressure in the States.
Yeah,
I think they recognise that they're just too fucking big by half.
Yeah,
and despite being the cliche time, light touch, laissez-faire person that I am, you do need regulation.
Yeah,
because completely unfettered markets will always tend towards monopolies, and everyone agrees monopolies are bad because then there's no competition, there's no sort of consumer justice, for want of a better word. But then you get natural monopolies forming, and these companies, I'm sure they've cut a few corners and done a few furtive deals on the way, but they're basically there on merit. They're there because they've just been very good at what they do.
Yeah,
whether it's providing a search engine, whether it's providing e-tail / internet services, whether it's dominating social media or whatever. But they have got to a point, and this happens. This is one of the things that the EU is quite good at. When a company gets so big, it's like, right, things are different now. You're a monopoly. Anything you do is by definition has competition implications. So a different set of rules apply to you. So I think that's one thing that might happen, but it's very hard. Another reason it's hard to do something about it, other than the fact that they've got armies of very expensive lawyers, is the corruption that's intrinsic in the political system, i.e. lobbying, campaign finance, and just how power works.
Yeah.
Powerful people tend to gravitate towards other powerful people. They tend to not want to fuck each other over. They tend to want to help each other out, and they go to the same golf club and the same marinas and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's difficult.
It's a tricky one, though, from a outsider looking in perspective to resolve, though, because you don't want a world that's dominated by Google, Meta and whoever it is, the handful of big sort of tech companies there are. On the one hand, you don't want that, but on the other hand, the fact that they are, and this is what the telcos always complain about, there are hundreds of us in Europe alone, and you look around the world, it's very fragmented. It's very hard to be a platform company, that word that gets used a lot these days, to have a platform and those kinds of network effects. I think it's the fancy sort of McKinsey management word that gets used for this stuff. If everybody's using Google as a search engine, or if everybody's using WhatsApp as a messaging platform, it kind of drives benefits, doesn't it? Everybody kind of everybody sees the benefits of doing that, and you don't get these kinds of you're on this system, I'm on that system, how do we get around that particular problem? But on the other hand, it kind of entrenches the power they have. So it's just a tricky one to resolve, I think.
And you get things like I just looked it up to make sure I'm using it right. Have you ever heard a thing called the Pareto principle? Basically, the sort of more less lofty way of describing it is the 80-20 rule, and just checked it out. This is the AI overview I get at the top of Google now.
Yeah, I mean, you can't avoid that.
Yeah, and it goes, it's the observation that 80% of outcomes come from 20% of causes.
Right.
And basically, that it's sort of in the area of that network principle, that the bigger you get this virtuous circle of just good things happen. Because your brand's big, and because you've got efficiencies and all that sort of thing. And things will naturally go that way. And just like you get it among populations of people. I mean, it's probably true that 80% of the useful, impactful shit that happens in the world is caused by 20% of the people, because they'll be the smartest, most hardworking, most driven people.
Yeah.
There aren't that many Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos type people around.
Yeah, well, that's even less than 20%, isn't it?
Yeah, well, exactly. Or Jensen Huang. But that's like the ultimate sort of extrapolation of that. But anyway, bring it back. That's another reason why Nscale is interesting. So they're daring to compete in a space that you might be forgiven for thinking is totally sewn up by about 3 or 4 companies.
Yeah.
They're UK. They're in a very capex intensive space.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of risk associated with it. I mean, to build a data center and buy a zillion GPUs off NVIDIA or AMD or whoever, it costs a fuck of a lot of money.
It does, and I guess they've mitigated the risk by having these anchor tenants essentially, and they know there's a sort of dependable stream of revenues there, which is great. I mean, that's what you want. If they'd just gone out and done it, then you'd be sort of warier about them, I guess. But if they've got people telling them we need these GPUs to do whatever it is, then
you can see why Sam is the investor relations guy. He had a really good answer to every objection or query or whatever. And he's presumably faced far more severe grillings than he did from us by investors.
Yeah.
And it's good. No, I wish him good luck, and we'll be watching this space.
Yeah.
And hopefully, guys, having met us over lunch and maybe even thought that we're all right company, you'll give us the scoop on any interesting shit that happens in future. But yeah, that's one to look out for, Nscale.
Yeah.
All right, shall we move on?
Mm-hmm.
Have we covered that?
Yeah.
Let's pass the ball to you. I mean, we both covered it, but given that it's one of your pet topics, there was. Well, I'll read our headline, and then I'm pretty sure I've got yours up. Where is it? Was it Clobbered Sales? Is it that one? Yeah, it is. Right. Yeah. So our headline. This is all based on an analyst firm that's quite telecom centric called Dell'Oro. And they came out with one of their reports. And what was our headline? Hold on, I've got it here somewhere. Yeah, our headline by Nick again. Subdued 5G activity leaves Open RAN in limbo. And Ian, your headline was Open RAN schism and backtracking have clobbered sales. So it looks like you're covering, you took similar angles, but why don't you tell us your angle?
Yeah, so Dell'Oro, as you say, is one of the 2 companies I think that sort of looks at the RAN market and does forecasting and projections and number crunching. Well. The other one being Omdia, which is part of us, basically part of our group. They're both really good.
They're part of Informa Tech Target, should be said. Omdia.
They are part of Informa Tech Target. I mean, they're both really reputable companies. Omdia and Dell'Oro. They're both highly regarded in the sector. Both.
We got one of Omdia's big guys for that space. Is that Remy?
Yeah, Remy Pascal does the numbers.
He's cool. I was hanging out with him in Istanbul.
Yeah, so he's our Stefan Pongratz is the guy at Dell'Oro who's the equivalent of Remy basically.
Okay,
and he's pretty active on LinkedIn. I mean, they put out their press releases, but and I don't speak to Stefan as much as I do Remy, but he's pretty active on LinkedIn, putting out his updates and his sort of views about what's happening with the RAN market. I mean, he's been quite he's been quite alarmist, I think, this year in a way.
Well, yeah, like the press release. I try to remember what the headline, but it was pretty unflinching.
He came out with one a few months ago.
I'm going to look it up,
saying it was the worst environment that he'd seen ever since he started doing this stuff about 20 years ago. So he's sort of going back right to 2000 when 3G was, when license bids were going on, and it was just before services were being launched. And it seems like he's been involved in this sort of tracking for that period, really, and certainly been in the market for some, for all that time. And he was saying it's the worst he's ever seen it, I think, in one of his LinkedIn posts.
Right.
And then he had an update a few weeks ago saying over the first 9 months of the year. So both he and Remy, by the way, have come out with figures for how things are going this year, but they've yet to come out with forecasts, as far as I'm aware, of what 2025 might be like. And maybe we won't get those until we're into 2025.
Here was the email subject field. So it's shared by Stefan's media relations colleague Daisy Kwok.
Yeah.
And the subject field is Open RAN tanks in 2024. Simple as that.
Yeah. So his figures, I think, for the overall RAN market a few weeks ago were that we were looking at a decline of between 10 and 20%, I think, for the first 9 months of the year, compared with the first 9 months of 2023. And if you look at Omdia, I think Remy's saying that he's feeling about the whole year at the moment is that we're looking at a decline of 10 to 15%. So they're pretty similar, these guys. They're sort of in the same ballpark as you'd expect. It's a really big drop, yeah? After last year, I think Omdia's figures, I don't know what Deloro said about last year, but they're probably the same, percentage point or two in it maybe. But Omdia's figures for last year were that it was down 11%.
Mm-hmm.
And another drop at the midpoint of 12.5% this year would mean you're looking at almost $10 billion in sales being wiped off over the last couple of years in annual sales.
Yeah.
Down from something like 45 to 35 billion a year. So the RAN market's just in a really bad state. So I think that's the first thing to note when you're looking at what's going on with Open RAN specifically.
Fair enough. That's context.
Is that everybody's suffering, yeah?
Yeah.
And we talk about this a lot on the podcast, but there's various factors.
We might mention the old S-curve and stuff in a sec.
Yeah. And this traffic issue, people not feeling that they're under pressure to necessarily invest in capacity, some kind of inventory correction that was going on for a long time in North America, which is obviously a really important market for anybody outside China. And just a sort of slight, what's the point, I think, on the part of the telcos when it comes to 5G? Why invest in nationwide 5G when the returns aren't there, really? Not there. So you've got a lot of... And Ericsson's always moaning about this, that 5G is not widely deployed enough and people haven't done enough mid-band build-out and all this stuff. And yeah, they haven't, but why would they if there's not a lot of money in it?
It's something you hear in lots of different areas. Like you hear it in politics and stuff where something's not working and you'll... At one side you'll go, then let's not bother.
Yeah.
But then the other side go, it's not working because we just haven't done it enough.
Yeah, exactly, which is pretty much what Ericsson said.
Yeah.
It's like, and the other thing they often say, I think, is if you don't do it now, then when these new services do come along, South Korea, they're going to be off, right?
Yeah, then you'll feel like
they're going to be sprinting,
won't you?
And then you're going to look really stupid, aren't you? Because you won't be able to support any of it. So maybe they have a point, I don't know, but so the Open RAN bit of it that was the update Stefan put out this week, and I don't know if Remy's done one because he hasn't been in touch with me. So maybe Omdia doesn't have one at the moment, or it's just not been revealed. But Stefan's view is that we're looking at a 30% decline, I think, for the first 9 months of the year with Open RAN. You've got the story up.
Yeah, well, I've got your story. I've also got the press release.
Yeah.
And the press release has got a diagram that talks about 40 to 50% decline, but that's from 22 to 24.
Yeah, that's over a 2-year period.
Yeah.
So I think there's a big drop this year.
Right.
And I think...
There we are. No, 30% year on year, you're right.
30% first 9 months of this year compared with the first 9 months of last year.
That's a big drop-off.
Is a much steeper drop-off.
In something that's supposed to be growing.
Yeah, you compare it with a 10 to 20% drop in the RAN, and you're obviously thinking, well, it's got a smaller market share then, hasn't it, than it had last year.
Yes, so it's declining absolutely, and it's also declining relatively.
Yeah. And he's got some quite detailed points on why that's the case. And I think Nick wrote about this as well. And this really gets to my head.
I'd never heard of ULP.
Well, you have heard of ULP. You've probably just not heard of it put that way.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think we've talked about this on the pod, but you remember there was this bust-up in the ORAN Alliance about the interface that was used for Massive MIMO.
Right,
to
vaguely.
connect. Yeah.
I mean, I know a lot of it's about
and you had
interfaces.
this thing called this compromise that came out of Osaka last year.
Right.
And it gets quite technical, but essentially what it's about is the exact way that you split the functions between the distributed unit, which is the compute bit of it, really, where most of the compute happens, things like layer 1 and, those expressions that you don't really like, and they're a bit confusing.
I just get a bit abstract.
It does get a bit abstract. And the radio unit, I mean, to keep it simple, it's where, which bits of software you do in the radio unit and which bits you do in the distributed unit.
Fair enough.
And you're trying to sort of apportion them between the two. And what they've done, I think the original ORAN Alliance specification for Massive MIMO, which is very advanced 5G stuff, very complicated, all sorts of beam forming and stuff that we were talking about with Cohere a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago. If you're doing it there, what the ORAN Alliance, which is a group behind specifications, had done is they decided most of the functionality should be in the DU, and try and keep the radio units as simple as possible, and not have much functionality in them. And I think the reason they did that was to try and make it easier for radio unit developers. Like lower the barrier to entry, essentially. Because
lower the complexity.
Yeah, because I think that for the telcos themselves, and certainly if you talk to Vodafone about this, and he's not there anymore, but Iago Tenorio, when he was there, he said it's much more important for us to have lots of radio unit vendors than it is to have lots of DU vendors.
Okay.
Because most of the spend's actually the radio units. That's where most of the spending goes.
And that's where there's more differentiation.
Yeah. And therefore I think the ORAN Alliance thought, well, if you can keep the radios quite simple, it makes it easier for smaller companies to overcome the kind of R&D hurdle, and you get this more sort of thriving market, and let's kind of lower the barrier to entry for that. The trouble with doing that, according to Ericsson, was that some of these uplink functions, if they're not in the radio unit anymore, it puts a huge amount of strain on the front haul. That's the bit between the radio unit and the DU unit, because you're sending a lot of information backwards and forwards. And they proposed this fix, which would involve taking some of that uplink functionality and putting it back into the radio unit. Okay. That was their workaround. Not particularly popular, obviously, unsurprisingly, with some of the Open RAN companies, including, I think, the likes of Mavenir, including Samsung, who felt there was actually nothing wrong with the original specification. They kind of disagreed with the analysis.
Right.
But there was support from...
Opinion is divided.
There was support from other telco. There was support from people like AT&T and Orange for this kind of stuff. But it ended up with... there was a disagreement about how it should be done. So what Ericsson wanted to do was pretty much put all the uplink functionality, all the important uplink functions back into the radio unit, including this thing called the equalizer that you use to address interference.
It's not like what we used to have in stereos in the 80s.
Well, I don't know, it might be, but it's like a thing that you use to sort of address interference, and that would go back into the radio unit as well. And some companies didn't like that for reasons to do with how it gets even more complicated, but some companies felt that you shouldn't put the equalizer in the radio unit. It would make the radio unit really complicated, and there were certain deployment options that you could take advantage of if you didn't have the equalizer in the radio unit. So what the ORAN Alliance did was it came up with two optional uplink performance, the ULPI thing that you've got there. It came up with these two optional extras that you could do and still be Open RAN compliant. And they essentially, the Ericsson preferred one is to put all the uplink functionality into the radio unit, including the equalizer, and the other one involves putting some of the uplink functionality in the radio unit, but keeping the equalizer in the DU.
Because I'm sure a lot of it is because I haven't bothered to really familiarise myself with the technical stuff.
Yeah.
But it does feel like sometimes they're arguing over... They're sweating the small stuff. I'm sure there are distinct technological implications to every decision that's made. But God, the way you describe it, it just feels like...
Well, this is why this is like wood for the trees stuff. Because
exactly.
So you're looking at the 30% decline,
and then they're arguing over this, relatively niche stuff.
But it's not relatively niche, because if you're going to be really cynical about this, and I know some people are, and I'm not saying, by the way, I necessarily go along with this argument, but one argument is that the reason Ericsson's pushing this is because it wants to upset Open RAN development. Yeah. because the more they
because
can,
they've always been a bit ambiguous about it.
They've been developing their technologies on the basis of, on the basis of the way they've always done things, which is to sell things as a sort of pre-integrated system.
Yeah.
And it suits them to do things in a certain way. And they don't really want to have to start thinking about doing radios that don't have equalizers in them.
Indeed.
Because that doesn't fit in with their plans.
And then that creates duplication and extra overhead.
Yeah, and therefore, if they can do something to upset the development of Open RAN specifications, you could argue that it's a sort of delaying tactic.
They would presumably deny that accusation.
Yeah, and you could also say that if it becomes harder, even with the fixes that have come out, to actually combine a radio unit vendor with a DU vendor because of the technical options that you've ended up agreeing with. So this argument that for the RU vendor, it's much, much easier to produce an RU without an equalizer and without all this uplink functionality. Well, Ericsson, clearly, it's not really in Ericsson's interest to have a diverse market for RU vendors, is it?
Indeed.
So by saying that let's keep the equalizer in the RU, you could, if you're being cynical, and as I say, I'm not necessarily going along with this, but you could say maybe the reason they're doing that is to thwart competition, and to make it very hard for anybody else to get into that market.
It's a coherent narrative.
So the technical side of it sounds complicated, but if you look at the market reasons why they might be doing that, then you could sort of read things into it, and I don't necessarily go along with all of that, but I think the other thing, what Stefan's saying. I've had some pushback, by the way, on my headline already from Gabriel Brown, our colleague.
Okay.
He says
he might be in the office. Yeah.
Well, he said he doesn't think that the reason. He said that he thinks that the line that the market's down 30% because of this EPLI situation is wrong. He says that's probably a slight part of it, but that's not really the real reason. He put a tweet up, and he might be right. It's probably not the main reason it's down 30%. I think the main reason it's down 30% is because the market itself, as we were saying, is not doing very well. And I think in a time when the market's not doing very well, people go to tried and trusted alternatives because you don't want to go and rely on a Mavenir. That we've had lots of reports recently from ratings agencies saying we're worried about Mavenir's ability to keep going.
We covered that on the pod a couple of weeks ago.
Year. You've got to be worried about who your suppliers are. And some of these smaller Open RAN vendors, at the moment, if you're a telco looking to do a 5G deal, what's that saying? Nobody ever got fired from buying from IBM or something.
Yeah, that's like back
I think
in the
people
80s
feel that even more in a downturn than they do in when things are growing and when there's an opportunity.
Well, you certainly don't want to buy, and I'm not suggesting. I mean, as we speak, Mavenir is having like a 2-day investor day.
It is,
or sort of general strategy update. I think.
Yeah.
And there have been some rumours, I think they're not confirmed, that some rumours of investment coming from whatever. But you wrote that thing a little while back, based just all on solid sources and data points, about how it's looking a little bit dicey. Obviously, as we do for any company, hope the best for them, and no one ever wishes any company to
I don't want them to get out of business. Yeah.
But I get your point. I mean, this is a thing. Also, we were saying how you get a positive virtuous circle by being big.
Yeah.
There's a sort of I don't know if blood in the water is the right analogy, but if people suspect you might be struggling a little bit, you can see how then you would get a negative spiral of people then like avoiding you. Like if you think someone's got COVID or something, you don't go anywhere fucking near them. People avoiding you, and then that compounds it because then you lose business and all that sort of thing. And again, I hope it doesn't happen to them. And I don't know what they've announced at this thing because they haven't made it public.
No.
But presumably they're fine.
I mean, from the little I've seen, it seems to be more about technology options and what their sort of latest pitch is for Open RAN. And I think someone was saying this week, so I think it might have been our colleague James, was saying it's more about the idea of they seem to be moving away from this pitch that Open RAN's about vendor diversity and trying to sell it in a slightly different way and position it in a slightly different way. Talking up things like AI, which to me sounds a little bit opportunistic.
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? When they shift the goalposts, I'm with you on that. It was originally a vendor plurality thing, with heavy push from the US state, because they didn't like, friendly though they are with Western Europe, they didn't really like the fact that that they've created a duopoly for themselves by ostracizing all the Chinese vendors.
I cheekily put a comment on a LinkedIn post that James had sort of shared some things that were going on at their strategy update, I think. And he was obviously allowed to do that because otherwise he wouldn't have done it, I guess.
But he's, as an analyst, he's dialed into it.
He's dialed into it, and I said it sounds like BS to me.
Yeah.
And you know, and I suspect probably Mavenir doesn't like me saying that, but I think if you're years ago saying, hang on, here's the main reason for Open RAN, it's all about TCO and it's all about vendor plurality, and then all of a sudden you've come out with a marketing pitch that includes things like AI. I mean,
that's where I think you're entitled to be sceptical, and that doesn't mean it's going to be wrong, but it is a pivot, and each new time you pivot, you're using up a little bit of credibility, and you're asking people to come with you.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's going to be wrong. But yeah, so if it's not about vendor plurality anymore, and one thing we've been saying for ages, and actually in a sec I'm going to address the matter of your position on Open RAN in general.
Yeah.
One thing we've been saying for ages is, certainly this was my thing, is if an Open RAN system doesn't deliver a distinctly improved technical outcome compared to going all in with Ericsson, let's say, then why take the risk?
Yeah.
So there isn't that incentive. So there's a vendor plurality, which in principle should drive costs down, and I don't think it has yet. There's the technical side, and I don't think Open RAN's been proven to be technically superior to, let's call it closed RAN, just to juxtapose it.
Well, the only way that technical superiority would happen is if the introduction of new competition leads to innovations that we haven't seen before.
Which hasn't happened yet. I mean, it may do,
happened,
but it's taking its time, isn't it?
Yeah, the economics just don't really make sense for things like that to happen, unfortunately.
And so, I've bumped into a few people over the years, sometimes when you're not there, and they've gone, Ian, what's Ian's problem with Open RAN?
Yeah.
So, and I've always said, I don't think he's got a problem with it. He's just being a journalist and calling it like he sees it. But why don't you quickly address that? Just put on the record what your, whether you think you have any bias or you have any agenda or you have any position on Open RAN.
I mean, I don't have anything against the companies that are trying to get into the radio access network market and be competitors to Ericsson and Nokia. Yeah? No. I don't have anything against those organisations. But I think the concept of Open RAN itself, I have issues with it as a... and it sounds like Mavenir now has issues with it if they're no longer pitching it as a vendor plurality thing, because that's what it was originally set up to be. I mean, what else is it? It's... We can... Unless you by Open RAN, you mean something else, and we could talk about this a bit, but unless you mean things like virtualization of the RAN, which is a slightly different thing.
Another area where
I don't like it when the things get conflated.
Yeah.
What Open RAN is a set of open interfaces between different bits of the RAN, so that instead of buying all your equipment from one supplier, you can pick and choose.
The way I've always pictured it, and I know I use this metaphor for another thing in a recent pod, but I've always pictured it like a closed RAN is like buying a MacBook, where Apple determines absolutely everything that's in the circuitry, and an Open RAN is more like buying a Windows PC, where when you go there, you can choose between different graphics cards, different CPUs, different, if it's a desktop, even like motherboards and things like that, and fans. And because all the interfaces are open, like PCI or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's the way I think about it. I don't know. You don't look totally convinced by that analysis.
A little bit, but it's... I mean, I think Open RAN... I know what you're saying, and I get the analogy to some extent.
You can chop and change the bits and bobs.
I get what you're saying, but you still go out and buy a Dell computer as a customer. It's pre-integrated by Dell. Yeah, okay, they're getting some of their componentry from third parties, just as Nokia gets some of its componentry from third parties.
And just as with Open RAN, you need some kind of SI, system integrator.
And that's what Nokia and Ericsson are. They're systems integrators, and that's what Dell does. The equivalent of Open RAN, what the telcos are talking about, is you'd be the guy who puts together your Dell computer. You'd go, because that's what the telcos are saying they want to do. Telcos like Vodafone, we go and buy the baseband from Samsung, and we go and get some radios from Mavenir, and we get a service management and orchestration platform from vendor C, and we get something else, and then we're the ones who put it all together. So it's like you making your own laptop. So
someone's got to be the SI.
Someone's got to be the SI.
You don't just buy a bunch of components and put it together like a kit.
I mean, that's one issue. But that's not really the main problem I have with it. I just don't see how the economics really make sense.
Right.
In a market that's not growing and that's actually shrinking, 10 billion wiped off in 2 years. We've gone down from 45 billion to 35 billion. Ericsson and Nokia are spending by AT&T's estimate, about 5 billion together on research and development in the RAN each year. Huawei, God knows what it is. They've got a huge budget. I mean, that goes on lots of other things, so we don't really know what's directed at the RAN.
And they're pretty opaque about
pretty
all
opaque.
private company and all
Samsung doesn't break out what it spends, but I did do a piece on them this week as well, where they were quite keen to emphasise. This is based on an interview with Alok Shah, who's like one of the top guys there. He was pretty keen to emphasise the fact that they can tap into investments that the bigger groups making on the chip side, especially like chips for radio units. Like they basically have a bit of Samsung that's just called Samsung Research that has a huge budget that will do investment in semiconductors, and Samsung Networks can piggyback on that. But other like Mavenir can't do that, and Parallel Wireless can't do that. They have much more limited resources while they're not really selling anything. So their only way to kind of compete with those guys and have the same kind of R&D clout is to raise a huge amount in funding, and you've got to do it year after year. You've got to put all this money. It's not just a one-off investment. You don't just spend 500 million on developing some new radios, because if you don't sell them, then they're out of date 2 years later. So you need to develop radios
again. Is some
again.
of the funding thing relevant to your story written a few days ago? Samsung looks to 20 billion war chest to beat Open RAN rivals.
Yeah, I mean that's Samsung's budget each year. That's the same as pretty much as what Huawei's got. Now obviously Samsung's doing TVs and it's doing other stuff, but they do make the point. E-sales. But they do make the point that even though their networks bit doesn't generate that much in revenues, so I think they made it was something like 2.5 billion, last year maybe in sales. So maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a little bit less. But if they're spending the same amount, as Ericsson or Nokia on R&D, they're only just covering their sales. Their sales are only just covering what they've spent in R&D.
In your piece, you say that R&D is 2.5 billion.
So, and then you've got all your other costs on marketing and sales and everything. So you're not even breaking even. You're running a loss-making business. And it's
you're playing a long game.
It's not enough to say, well, okay, but we're going to spend the same percentage of our sales on R&D as Ericsson and Nokia do, which is about 20%. Because if you're only generating $10 from deals that you've done that year, then you're spending nothing on R&D, because 20% of $10 is nothing, obviously. So they have to be able to put a certain amount up just to get the same kind of portfolio capabilities. Now, what you could say is, well, let's have them specialise instead. This is what Open RAN was supposedly all about.
You'd have one person who's really good at one little bit.
We'll do the radio units. We'll do the service management orchestration. We'll do this. We'll do that. Well, the problem is that the big telcos, and the best example of this is the AT&T deal, have shown that they still want to deal with a fairly small number of big suppliers. They still want to get most of their stuff, if not all of it, from one or two big suppliers. Hence AT&T's $14 billion, the biggest ever deal that Ericsson's ever done. That's an Open RAN deal, though. But they're obviously going to Ericsson to buy most of their stuff from Ericsson.
Exactly. So to what extent is it Open RAN, other than that it's compatible with the...
But I think what that's made people do is you've had this whole single vendor Open RAN thing has made people like Mavenir and various other companies as well realise that it's not good enough just to have a DU. They need to have radios as well. They need to have a systems integration capability. So then it's an even harder thing for them to do, because then they're basically competing on a like-for-like basis against Ericsson and Nokia. They're not an Open RAN company anymore. They're a full RAN. They're not a specialist. They're a company that does everything. So then it's really hard, because then you really do have to put a lot of money into all these different areas while you're not making anything in sales. I mean, if it takes off for them, by the way, and let's say they carve out some decent market share, but how many companies can do that in a market that's not growing, that generates 35 billion a year? To cover your R&D cost of 2.5 billion, you'd have to have a 7% market share just to cover your R&D costs in a market of that size. So that's a limited number of companies that can reasonably compete. There's just the economics just don't make sense.
Not right now.
The market's just not big enough to support.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're counting on, I suppose, very patient capital. And whoever invests in companies like Mavenir needs to be patient. They can't be like, "Where's my fucking return? Where's my exit?"
Yeah, but even if Mavenir does succeed, and even if they're the ones who get who manage to carve out, so that will only happen with Ericsson and Nokia being weakened.
Yeah,
if they grow
the size of the pieces of the pie.
Have you seen what Nokia's situation's like at the moment? People talking about the mobile networks being split off and sold, and what a disaster it is. Look at their margins. Have you looked at Ericsson's margins?
I haven't.
Why is there this perception?
Their margins are very small.
They don't make fat margins. There's
No.
perception that we need to drive down costs to the bare minimum. I can see where it comes from because the telcos don't make any money.
It's not like they're making Nvidia margins.
They want to drive down their costs as much as possible, like any business would, and the imperative to do that's even stronger now because their own ARPUs are in decline. But the problem is, it's not as though your suppliers are in a very healthy condition.
Yeah.
So if you weaken your big suppliers by introducing somebody else into the mix and giving them a load of work, are you better off then with a weak Nokia, with a weak Ericsson, and maybe Mavenir's got 10% market share?
Indeed,
Maybe they're not doing
and
too badly.
there's another paradox there, which is, on the geopolitical side, I mean, this has been the narrative for a while, certainly since, for the whole 5G era, that governments view telecoms as a matter of strategic importance.
Yeah.
Both in terms of security, like protecting themselves, often failing, as we spoke about last week with that Salt Typhoon thing. But the initial premise, here's another thing that's completely, the goalposts have shifted and metastasized. The initial premise behind keeping Huawei out of networks was that they're too cozy with the Chinese Communist Party, and the CCP at any moment can basically compel Huawei to suddenly expose all these vulnerabilities that are theoretically, although none of this has been proven, baked into their kit.
Yeah.
And then get up to all sorts of dastardly deeds. And that was that. And, I've pushed back on that in the past, and we've had chats with people like John Strand, who's a bit more hawkish about it. But that's completely metastasized. And now it's just like, now we can't have China catching up with us.
Yeah.
Just end of.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So, yeah, it's another example. That's one thing we do. That's something I was explaining to, we were explaining to the Nscale guys yesterday when we went off on tangents chatting more about media than their core business. Is like, it is our job to be skeptical.
Yeah.
Because I was saying, if you saw my inbox or you saw Ian's inbox and you see the sheer amount of incoming marketing-led propaganda that we get, the biggest service we do to our audience, other than just presenting news in a timely fashion, is to be a filter, is to be a skeptical filter. I mean, I don't blame them. It's the job of marketing and PR people to present the people they're representing in the most positive light. But it's our job to be skeptical about that and go, what's really going on?
Yeah. And so to sum up my position on Open RAN, I'm not against the idea of openness per se, or the idea that other companies should be able to come along and challenge the big players. All I'm saying is a market of that size isn't big enough to support lots and lots of different suppliers. A market of that size that has the R&D needs it does, where you've got companies spending billions of dollars each year on very sophisticated equipment that they're going to sell to a global audience so that you and me can enjoy very low-cost services. The way it's set up economically, quite similar to the chip sort of industry, it isn't big enough to support 12, 13 different vendors.
Yeah.
And if it were, by the way, then 12, 13 different vendors would still exist. The reason consolidation happened was because the economics didn't make sense. You used to have Motorola, Nortel, you go further back, people like Marconi, Ericsson. There were at one time about 11, 12 different Nokia, the Siemens, there were lots of companies doing baseband and radio access network stuff and ran radio units. And the economics didn't suit that model. And we had consolidation, and we have these three big players basically. And I think I think personally that the telcos themselves are cynical about Open RAN. They wouldn't tell you this, but I don't think they believe in Open RAN. I think Open RAN, what Open RAN was all about was what you were just saying. We ban the Chinese. All of a sudden, we're left with a duopoly. Yeah. We need at least one other. We need one or two other players in the market. They don't want 7 or 8 options, but they don't want a duopoly.
And I think the Americans probably would secretly like, Motorola to be back to its heyday or something like that. They would like there to be an American Ericsson.
I just don't understand why the Americans care as much about this as they do. I mean, I think some of it comes from...
some of it is just geopolitical chess beating.
But I think years ago, they thought 5G was a lot more important than it's turned out to be. And
Well,
it wasn't just a new connectivity thing to replace 4G.
Yeah.
It was about powering fighter jets and insulin drips in your arm and self-powered cars.
Yeah, and
all
someone
this
could hack
stuff.
into 5G and then suddenly turn everyone into zombies.
And none of that's actually happened. And yet you still get elements, I think, of American officialdom that seem to think it's important for them to have a role. But they do have a role because Intel does a lot of baseband chips. Marvell does a lot of baseband chips. The cloud computing players are involved in networks these days.
I mean, they just don't have a big radio vendor.
Dell and HP, they don't have a rate. They don't. That's exactly what they don't have. They don't have the radio unit vendor.
Yeah.
But I mean, the best option they've got probably is, if they're trying to do that, probably is Mavenir. Maybe it could benefit from some kind of injection of funds by, it's already had a lot of funding put into it, by the way, by a company called Koch Industries, it is, which is Charles Koch's sort of investment vehicle. And then there's another one called Sirius Capital.
They're both very well known.
They've been the two big backers, but they've put all this money in, and they've still got
Sirius
nothing
Capital
to really.
Is known for its patience.
They've got nothing to show for it at the moment, and now you've got this rumours about a potential Saudi investment, but we've still not seen anything happen. And I don't know what's going on at this analyst day, but if I was an analyst and I was at that event, if I'd been allowed to go as a reporter, which we weren't, because a colleague of mine did inquire and they weren't having reporters there. The big question for me would be, what does next year hold for you, given all the concerns about funding? Are you still viable, and where are the deals coming from? And those would be not some silly little marketing slide going on about AI and stuff like that. that just is bullshit. So, and I said it in a LinkedIn post
which is
last
what
night,
BS stands for.
but I stand by it.
Okay. I think that's all clear, and just one last thing I'll say from a journalist point of view. When we write, I've got an image that I bought of our image provider, which I've called Telecoms Recession. It's basically like a sort of NASDAQ board, but instead of being a company, it's telecoms, and it's got like curves going down and downward arrows and numbers and negative numbers and that sort of thing. And any time I write about Telecoms Recession, I don't do it gleefully. There's no sort of morbid sort of schadenfreude from it, because I'm part of the telecom industry, as are you, and we rely on it to pay our bills. And more than that, well, not more than that, but as well as that, we also find it interesting because we've invested a big chunk of our professional lives in learning about it.
Yeah.
So we've got a massive investment on lots of levels, but we've also got a professional obligation to call things as we see them. And that means don't be too doom-mongery, but don't be a cheerleader either.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'll say to anyone whoever just gets a bit butthurt about our angles. And I think Ian tends to provoke people much more than I do, because you tend to write more substantial pieces. It's nothing personal.
Yeah. There's one thing I haven't talked about with the story, which is the backtracking side of it, which isn't to do with these split options that we went into some detail on. And I think I talked about this after I got back from Fuse, because I sort of got the heads up on it there and asked Ericsson specifically, and then got the answer that I wanted, really. But it seems they're not actually supporting Open RAN in some of their products anyway. Ericsson,
right?
So this idea that Ericsson's all in on Open RAN and it's fully compliant, and this AT&T network. This is the problem. One of the problems I have with this AT&T deal being pitched as an Open RAN deal is apparently they're massive MIMO when it's purpose built. So by purpose built, we mean running on Ericsson's processors, not using Intel's general purpose processors. They're not complying with Open RAN standards. So they will. If you're AT&T, I don't know what AT&T's plans are for the split between virtual RAN and purpose built RAN, but you'd have to be very, very brave at the moment to build a virtual RAN on a sort of nationwide scale, wouldn't you? Given Intel's predicament.
Yeah.
So I suspect a lot of
I don't think we've seen the last of government money going into
right.
Intel.
And from what I've been told so far, most of the investment activity that's happening on that network, most of the rollout activity has been to do a purpose-built radio access network. Well, anywhere that they're doing massive MIMO, you're only using Ericsson's DUs with Ericsson's RUs, because they're not opening the standard. They're not opening the interface to be compliant, which they confirmed to me.
Okay.
So this stuff about Fujitsu and Mavenir being introduced as radio unit vendors, the only opportunity for those guys is to do small cells.
That's right.
Or to do remote radios.
Yeah, what was the deal recently that had Fujitsu doing the remote ones?
So
Was that in the UK?
Fujitsu was named right at the beginning of the AT&T deal, and everybody's like, well, where does it fit in exactly? But they were talked about at Fuse during a session there where small cells was quite clear that's what they're going to be doing. So not big macro sites basically. And then Mavenir got named, I think, about 2 weeks ago, maybe a week ago, as a new radio unit vendor that AT&T kind of was going to introduce into its network. Well, likewise, Mavenir will not be doing massive. It won't be providing the sexy stuff. Basically, it won't be providing the advanced 5G stuff because Ericsson's not opening the interfaces where it's purpose built. So unless a lot of this is a cloud RAN, unless a lot of it's virtualized, there just isn't an opportunity for those companies to play anyway.
I was just looking up the one I was thinking. Yeah, it was the Nokia deal with Deutsche Telekom. That's where Fujitsu did the rural radios, I think. Yeah. Okay.
But at least on that case, I mean, you could say, Nokia's quite, Nokia has been sort of critical in a roundabout way, I think, of Ericsson's approach on this. But comments that sort of Tommy Wheater made to me when I interviewed him at the start of the year, he was clearly having a sort of dig about Ericsson not kind of being that supportive of Open RAN in this area. But even he concedes that, even if you do comply with the interfaces, in massive MIMO it's extremely hard to pair two different vendors. It's just so you've got to match your algorithms, and there's so much hard
work.
Just
inefficient.
It's not the best way to do it. So even on that Deutsche Telekom project that you just mentioned, I think anywhere there's massive MIMO, radio units and DUs are coming from Nokia.
Yeah.
And Fujitsu's role is only on the remote radios.
Where you don't have massive MIMO.
But
so I'm gonna,
at least they've been honest on it. At least they've been quite upfront about it,
Yeah, and one thing to think of, just to wrap this up, if you don't mind, because it's just one or two little bits that I want to talk about briefly that sort of overlap.
Yeah.
And we're running out of time.
Did this go on for ages, this session?
That's fine. No, we're not over time in general. But I'm just keeping an eye on it, and we've probably got about 20 minutes or something left. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, one of the interesting things that I took from yesterday, our lunch, and Nokia being involved, very much on the fixed line side of things, is it took a while for the Alcatel-Lucent acquisition to settle down. And mega M&A is always disruptive, and as I'm sure we're going to talk about plenty of times on the pod, as this Vodafone 3 thing plays out, it's as many analysts have said, it's a great opportunity for their competitors to steal a march while they're fucking getting their ducks in a row.
Yeah.
But now Nokia, with everything we've just been saying, this is where it kind of goes full circle. With everything we've just been saying about the RAN market in general, the radio market that is, Nokia's greater spread of technological exposure now suddenly looks like a strength, because they're involved with exciting companies like Nscale and whatever else they're doing on the fixed line side, whereas Ericsson's all in on mobile.
Yeah.
And so if mobile's not having a great time of it, Ericsson doesn't have a plan B, really, does it?
No, I mean, Ericsson's doing very well in mobile, has to be said. They are, if you go back a few years.
Whereas Nokia's had well-documented struggles in that area.
It has, yeah. And, they... whatever you say about them, they've obviously lost some, they've lost some deals that they wouldn't have wanted to lose, and it's not looked good for them at all in North America. And we talked about that T-Mobile speculation that maybe they did the same thing. And
that hasn't happened.
It hasn't happened, and I don't know. Let's see what happens there. And I don't think they've got product problems.
We'll get Earl on to explain himself.
Yeah, I don't think they've got the product problems they had years ago. I really don't. But they've obviously had some setbacks that they would not wanted to have had. And I think Ericsson's done incredibly well since Ekholm took charge. Unfortunately, he's just in a shitty market.
Yeah,
and they don't have a plan. They don't have anything else because he sold off other things. They don't have anything else.
That was my only point. But you're right. I mean, they're good at what they do, but the market currently is not a buoyant one. Buoyant. It's not buoyant for Boyer.
Yeah.
So let me just wrap up. Just a couple of little quickies that kind of overlap on what we've been saying, and bits of news that I think I've covered. Yeah, the two stories I've written. So one kind of overlaps with the struggling radio mobile market, which was, I probably said before on the pod, but the way we allocate stories at Telecoms.com when we're all sitting down in the morning seeing what's going on is our freelancers Nick and Mary get first shout, then Andrew gets a shout, and then I charge myself with just finding what's left and writing that up. And sometimes it means you have to be quite creative. It sometimes plays into my interests of like the more geopolitical stuff or like digital civil liberties and that sort of thing. But I just noticed there's a company called Cloudflare, and they're like plugged into the internet. I can't remember. I sometimes lose track of what these different companies do, but they're one of the people that enable the internet to work.
Are they the ones that had the outage issue?
No, I thought that when I was reading it. It's another one that sounds like it, but it's not Cloudflare. God, what are they called?
I can't remember now.
No, but they weren't the ones that had that nightmare. And they once a year they come up with this they call Cloudflare Radar, where they just come out with fairly detailed, granular stuff on various things of what's happening in the internet and trends. Anyway, and I was looking through their stuff, and a lot of stuff is just too arcane and abstract for me to get my head around. But they have a data point where they say what proportion of all internet traffic ends up in mobile devices as opposed to sort of fixed terminals, I guess you could call them, like PCs or whatever. Or I guess tellies. And last year, the proportion of mobile traffic to non-mobile traffic, so mobile was 41... Oh no, last year it was 41.9% was mobile.
Right.
And this year is actually down to 41.3. Now, it's only, 0.6%.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was interesting because the intuitive assumption would be that mobile is always going to be taking up a bigger piece of the pie because that's just where everyone goes. People are spending more time on their phones as opposed to their PCs or whatever.
Yeah.
And I, that's all I really have to say about that. Just that data point. And it's from Cloudflare, and you can read my story. It's called "Mobile Share of Total Internet Traffic Seems to Be Declining," but it feeds into a broader narrative that we've covered many times on the pod, and you have, especially in your writing, informed in part by our regular guest William Webb, who's been saying for years that it's not so much that the pattern of internet traffic's on an S-curve. So an S-curve is like shaped like an S, but more like an S that's been elongated a little bit. So basically you've got an initial relatively flat phase, and then it curves up to an exponential phase, but then that exponential phase eventually decelerates and levels off into the top of the S.
Yeah. Was someone querying William's stuff yesterday at the lunch?
Yeah.
Was it Sam or someone was saying that he'd rather trust data from this source than from William necessarily?
Yeah, I remember who it was, but I'm not sure. Even though everything was on the record, I think I'm going to be on the side of discretion and not say who it was.
Yeah.
They didn't say anything too outspoken, but it was just me and them chatting, and it just felt a bit more like an aside. So I'm not gonna name them.
Yeah.
But but it's a fair pushback. I mean, William is only one person, and he's only got a finite amount of data to draw from. That's not saying I disagree with him, but I also don't think he's the Oracle of Delphi. I mean, we're all just drawing from a fraction of all the data available. But I think a lot of what William says, and it's been borne out by these downward revisions that Ericsson's done. Basically, what he's arguing is that we're further along the S-curve than people like Ericsson would have us believe. Now, Ericsson's obviously got a professional interest in presenting the rate of mobile global data traffic growth being as rapid as possible, because the more data traffic there is, the more need there is to buy their kit to service that traffic, to accommodate it.
Yeah.
And Williams always argued that we're actually getting closer towards the peak of the levelling off phase. And then every subsequent downward revision of Ericsson's numbers would seem to support his assertion. And anyway, and that's the only point I want to make about this story is, here's another little data point that says, somewhat counterintuitively, that year on year, the proportion of total internet traffic that is accounted for by mobile devices has gone down. That would seem to support that general view.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, it's a difficult one when you look at the sort of percentages changes as opposed to the actual, number itself. I mean, this is a pushback, I suppose, on some of Williams'
So all internet traffic, by the way, is up 17% year on year. So it's still growing.
Right.
It's just the proportion of it.
Yeah, so it's still gone up quite a lot.
Yeah.
And, I guess...
But that's slowing. Last year, the growth was 25%.
Yeah. I mean, as these numbers get bigger, the percentage changes are obviously going to be smaller anyway, and it gets to the point where even a 1 percentage point change can actually be a huge amount of petabytes.
Yes, because you've got so many
because
people who
there's
are
so
connected.
much of it that it could still be more than it was years ago when you were looking at 40% changes, but traffic was at a really small level. Yeah, I think that's the caveat I would make about S-curves. And I think we did ask William about this when he was on, and he went, well, you know, if you look at the way spending's done, it's actually very much based on percentage changes, and that's the thing to really sort of be looking at rather than the absolute sort of difference. But although I probably have to go back and listen to the podcast again.
Well, we're out of time to have a. It's basically just another little anecdotal data point.
Yeah, I'm sort of curious to. I think William's stuff's really compelling, by the way. Are we about to finish?
No, we're good.
I think his stuff's really compelling.
I just sometimes detect body language from Pierre.
I was just looking
out the corner of my eye.
And I think his research and his numbers and everything, and he's obviously like he looked into this a lot and thought about it a lot, and he's a professor. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to second guess.
I completely respect him as a thinker and as an analyst.
And he's you know he's very respected, and he's got he's worked hard on this. So, but he's like you say, he's not the oracle. So I don't know. Yeah. There are alternative views, and you know there could be something we just don't anticipate. Well, it's very hard to predict the future.
There was some quote. It's like no, I can't remember. I'm going to butcher it. But one of those little paradoxical quotes of like, that's it. I never like to make predictions, especially about the future. I'll get a little slight tangent within those before I get into the last item. What countries, I mean, you can think of individual countries or regions, do you think would have the highest proportion of mobile to fixed internet traffic?
I'd say India would be up there.
It's not on my list. It could have been. I mean, I just picked a few. The very highest.
I'd say African countries.
Yeah. So there you're bucking up the right trade. The highest of all was Sudan.
Yeah,
another one that was really high is Syria, but that could be a consequence of their civil war and their infrastructure getting fucked up.
I mean, it's anywhere there's not a fixed line network, and I suppose there are fixed line networks in India, but even there I would have thought, so probably as a percentage, it falls behind a lot of African countries.
So Sudan's the top, Syria's the third top, second top is Cuba, which is interesting. Right. And again, it could be just because of their system of government.
They're probably using US networks.
And because America's, they're probably just piggybacking on fucking Key West or something. But then a really funny one of the lowest, i.e., so this is just 23% of all their internet traffic is mobile, is Finland.
Right.
You wouldn't expect that, would you? The home of Nokia.
Although it's also, the Nordic countries are big on fixed line rollout, aren't they? And fibre and all this.
Fair enough. So. And then even lower is Ireland at 15%.
Yeah.
Which again, maybe their national broadband. I mean, we had one of the award winners at the Glotals was Irish national broadband. So maybe they're still a bit early in that. And then the bottom of all is Iran, which is 6%. So 6%? clearly their mobile networks are shite.
Well, you're probably not allowed to use a mobile.
Indeed.
You'd be seized by the Revolutionary Guards.
It'd be somehow heretical.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then the very last thing I want to chat about, which more sort of overlaps with some of the US side and the geopolitical side. And the only reason I want to tell it is just for one thing, which I just think is interesting and poignant. So my headline was, US set to belatedly approve additional $3 billion for rip and replace program. So the US decided ages ago. Turns out there are still, I mean, none of the big mobile networks I think have got any Huawei or ZTE in them, have they?
No.
But then there's some other
they're not supposed to have.
Yeah, there's some other like niche rural ones or whatever that have still got it. And the American government went, well, fucking get rid of that.
Yeah.
And they went, well, that's really expensive.
Yeah.
Because as we've spoken about loads of times, there's an obsolescence cycle. And let's say you buy a bit of kit and you expect the asset to be functional for 10 years. Any time before 10 years you get rid of it, then that's hitting your balance sheet. It's a cost that you wouldn't have otherwise had to incur. And so a few years ago they went, all right, then we'll give you a couple of billion for the lot of you to do it. And straight away they went, that's nowhere fucking near enough.
I don't understand this story at all.
Right. Why don't you?
Because in the UK, they went, you can't use Huawei after this date. And everybody went, okay, if that's the law,
yeah.
then
Well,
we
I
have to
think
comply with it.
maybe it's more accelerated in the States. Maybe that's the reason.
Well, it seems to be less accelerated. It seems to be like they gave $2 billion. Everybody's been faffing around saying we're not going to do it.
No,
But
I think that's a very good point.
If you're told by the security agency in your country that you need to get this out, and I would have thought the US would be more strict with this kind of stuff than anybody. It's
You
like,
would,
get
wouldn't
rid
you?
of.
Well, it shows how inefficient they
CTOs
are.
going, oh well, we like Huawei. We don't really want to get rid of them.
So this thing was first signed into law 4 years ago.
I know. I don't get it at all.
I think what you're observing is a paradox between the top line strategic imperative and then the bureaucratic implementation of it.
Right.
And so they signed it into law and they gave them $1.9 billion, and it was just like, and they were like, look, man,
and I don't understand why they're giving them money to do it either.
Well, for the reason I just described, because they're compensating them for the balance sheet loss.
We didn't compensate our telcos to do it.
Right, but that doesn't mean we're right.
No, I know, but it's a weird thing to expect taxpayers to cough up for. This sort of thing.
Well, I'm with you on that.
I'm
with you on that.
Why are taxpayers coughing up for a decision that the US security agencies have decided that it's not safe to have Huawei in, but that's not you and me. The average American's not made that decision. Why is he paying out of his pocket to fund a Huawei replacement?
I'm with you. I think that about a lot of strategic decisions that are made. I mean, it wouldn't be appropriate even if we did this at the start of the pod, but we're not going to do it now because we're right at the end.
I mean, this is a good topic for another pod.
Yeah, but you can go off on all sorts of non-telecoms tangents, like how is it in the US taxpayers' interest to be sending billions of dollars to Ukraine or to Israel or to all these foreign adventures? The amount of US taxpayer money that's been spunked on foreign adventures just in the time I've been alive is just zillions of dollars. Anyway, but that's a complete tangent. But it plays into your perfectly good query, which is why should the taxpayer pay for it? And I imagine if we had an American politician on, let me quickly finish. If we had an American politician on and he'd go, it's in their indirect interest because security.
I mean, I'm more sympathetic towards the funding for Ukraine or something, because that's like you could say why should the UK have bothered when Germany went into Poland? Why should anybody take an interest? That's a big geopolitical war type decision about where things could end up. Getting rid of Huawei in the network, where
I might take you up on this after when we get to the pub.
But this is what I'm comparing it to, right? I'm comparing it to a Chinese vendor in your telecom network where there's never been any proof that they've got spyware in the kit, and they're not owned by the Chinese government. And what damage could they do in these tiny rural networks anyway? And yet you're expecting the US taxpayer to come along.
But the narrative is to conflate the security risk as being equivalent. So you can see a greater security implication for intervening in like global conflicts before they get too big.
Yeah.
But the way the American security state is like, this is just as big a deal. And I agree with you, it isn't necessarily. And we can get into that, but we can get into that in the pub. But so they finally, all the lobbying have been is like, you giving us $2 billion, we need $5 billion.
Yeah.
And then that been ignored for 4 years. And then finally, the other thing you get is you get a lot of shit actually getting done right at the end of administrations when there's no political risk anymore. Like the elections already happened. So you get this weird period in America where the elections happen and you've got 2 or 3 months where no one's electioneering anymore.
Yeah.
It's a done deal. And sometimes that kind of greases the cogs a little bit and things get done. And so they just come out, they've got this defense budget, which this year, so each new year they pass a new law saying how much money they're going to chuck at the Pentagon. This year it's $850 billion Pentagon's getting, or the bill is.
Yeah.
But another thing they do in America, we do it here, but as with so many things in America, they do it more, is they just lob a bunch of other shit in there. Because they're $850 billion. So what's a few bill here or there?
Yeah.
You could just put in a bill just to fucking fix my roof. No one's not going to notice, are they?
No.
Although I hasten to add to my insurance company.
You're starting to sound like Elon Musk now.
Yeah. Well, but in reverse.
Yeah.
So let's not go.
Don't they fail every audit they do?
They always fail audits. Yeah. And, and America's in a slightly unique position. Like you were talking about taxpayers, but all this really is more debt. And America's in a slightly unique position when it comes to debt because they are the global reserve currency.
Yeah.
So they can kind of print money and they're a bit insulated from the effects of it. Not totally. And they still pay, just like in the UK, about the fourth highest item in the national expenditure is debt interest.
Yeah.
And you think if they didn't have all that interest, that could be getting spent on public services or whatever. Or more fucking wars if you're into that.
Yeah.
And so it's $850, this bill, and there's just one tiny little bit in the bill called Section 5405, and it's named, I actually just took a screenshot of it. It's in that sort of Times New Roman font that you get from legal documents. I took a screenshot of it, and it just says, Section 5405, increase in limitation on expenditure under Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Reimbursement Program, which is their posh name for rip and replace. And then all it says, I'll read it out because it's so short. It says, Section 4K of the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Act of 2019, brackets, some stuff that's not relevant, is amended by striking 1,900,000,000 and inserting 4,980,000,000. And that is it. That's the only reference you get to it. So they've basically just magicked up over $3 billion with that one tiny little sentence that I just read out. And I just think it's interesting. I'm not even necessarily saying I disagree with it. It's just amazing how $3 billion can just get fucking conjured out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And yet it took them 4 years to do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know what held them up. I don't know what suddenly makes them want to do it. Obviously, the US telecoms industry is happy about it because they suddenly got $3 billion more in taxpayers' funds. But I'm with you. I don't know if they necessarily deserve it. And as you say, it's not something we've done here.
Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, here we had a sort of hard line. You need to get it out by 2027. It didn't seem to take that long to get it done. I know there was an initial plan not to take out as much and to try and just limit it to the core. There was probably some pressure from the US. I think everybody thinks to go a bit further, and there were some sanctions that might have made the UK authorities think differently anyway in terms of the technologies that Huawei might be using and where they were coming from. But then they said this is what you've got to do, and the operators went, well, we've got to do that, and we're going to have to comply with it. And
then they pushed back a little bit and asked for
back a bit,
it to be delayed.
And then they have to show, over the last couple of years, they've had to show themselves reaching certain targets. I think the core network one's passed in January, didn't it? That was the one that BT had to sort of say it's got Huawei finally out of its core, and they all needed to be at 35% of traffic on the RAN by this summer or something that they've obviously done. They're monitored on this. They do.
Well, we're English, aren't we? We moan a bit and then we just get on with it.
And they didn't get taxpayer money to do it. They just did it. The telcos are complaining about that, obviously. But I don't get why this thing's been rolling on for so long in the US with these crappy little rural networks. That.
Ian said that. I think you're lovely.
These crappy little rural networks that were using Huawei because that's the only way they could do it economically, and they've been told to do something about it, and nothing's happened in 4 years, it seems. And now they're getting another $3 billion in taxpayers' money.
So to sign off, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. My feeling is that you've got American foreign policy. I've ranted in the past on the pod about how self-harming some of their geopolitical initiatives are, especially as they're trying to suppress the technological development of China. How, firstly, I question the morality of it, but secondly, it's also self-harming. It's hurting their own companies, including Nvidia. Although no one's getting a violin out for Nvidia because they're doing just fucking fine.
No, I mean, imagine if Nvidia didn't have restrictions on it to sell to China.
Yeah, it'd be doing even better. Well, I tell you what it would do. It'd probably sell less shit to non-Chinese companies.
Well, yeah.
Given that it seems to not be able to keep up with demand. But anyway, that's another matter. I just think this is one of the problems, that the American military security state seems to be so unfettered that it will just decide. You'll get these people in the Pentagon or in the CIA or NSA or one of these fucking alphabet agencies go, nah, man, we're not happy with China. And then suddenly it costs the US taxpayer loads of money. And I'm with you. I thought your pushback was totally valid, and I'm largely sympathetic to it. I think it's out of control, and there doesn't seem to be any sense of sort of financial restraint. They'll just chuck billions of dollars around on a whim. Cool. All right. Well, let's wrap it up there. So, actually, one thing I wanted to quickly mention before we go off. Last week we spoke about our Spotify numbers, Pierre, and then was it you that shared it on our LinkedIn? And then I reshared what Pierre put up on the Telecoms.com LinkedIn. And I just want to say thank you to all, like loads of people just went hurrah for you, and they're all very nice. And thank you to all of you. That was really nice to get those good vibes off everyone. It's just a reminder that people do listen, and that some people don't find it too tedious, which is great.
God, I don't find it tedious.
No, I know. I was just being English and self-effacing. And yeah, so we get one more next week. I mean, Ian and I, we're off on holiday from Monday, but we're gonna come in just for you because we love you so much, audience. We're gonna come in just for you on Thursday, and so is Elena.
We're not off on holiday together. We should
hasten to add. Yeah, we're gonna go off on holiday together and talk about telecoms for 2 weeks. Can you imagine? Meanwhile, our wives are like, "Oh, for fuck's sake."
Pictures of masts and antennas.
Yeah,
I have done that.
Yeah,
I was doing it. Ask Cathy. I was doing it in Istanbul.
Yeah.
Moaning about roaming tariffs.
Yeah. Ask Mrs. Telecoms.com. I was doing it in Istanbul. And so that'll be. So this is the penultimate one. That'll be recorded next Thursday. We'll probably put that up on the Friday or something. And so yeah. So thanks for listening, and make sure you join us for that last one.